So yes, the title is tonight is The Town of the Queen of the Angels of Beginnings, Cities, and Myths. Thank you for coming. I'm so excited to talk with you about all this. I think it's going to be a blast. But you should know what we're doing here. So mythological dimensions of the City of Angels does not mean the popular connotation of myth. We're not going to uncover all the falsehoods, lies, etc. of Los Angeles. It's not about that. In fact, it's really about the opposite. It's about the stories that we tell ourselves as a city and as Angelenos that are true. They're true because we live them out. We might not even know these stories. You don't need to know a story to live it out. And in fact, in Western culture, it's more likely than not you won't know the story you're living out. But you still have it, or rather, it has you. So we're going to talk about myth as story, particular stories. You're going to hear about a lot of great characters of Los Angeles, including, everybody always asks me this, are you going to talk about Sister Amy? Amy Semple McPherson, of course. No series on Los Angeles should overlook Sister Amy. She was amazing. She'll be in our Tricksters section, by the way. And we're just going to hear some stories that are not just stories, because we all talk LA stories all the time. I want the deepest stories. I want the stories with a meaning. I want to find and tell you and talk with you about the stories of this city that form this city, that form Angelenos, that affect our behavior and our thinking about who we are. So, meaningful stories in a city of stories, that's what we're about in this series. Now tonight, creation myths. Creation myths of Los Angeles? Oh yeah, this is going to be fun. Wait till you see. But I always love to do etymology because I always learn something new, and I learned something new tonight for tonight's talk. I was looking up civitas. I'm like, yeah, I know all that. I could do 20 minutes on civitas and cities. But I did not know, I knew that civitas had to do with citizenship or the rights of a citizen, membership in a community. I did not know it meant to lie, as in to lie down. Couch, with a secondary sense of beloved or dear. I love it when etymologies create mysteries. What would that mean for a city to be beloved or dear? And because it's a place where you can lie down and rest. Well, I immediately thought that that's exactly what a city is. Because if you look at the history of cities, they don't emerge out of nothing. They don't emerge accidentally or in any kind of place. They emerge in particular places at particular times for particular reasons. And one of the main reasons is food and water. And so the great cities emerged in the River Valley civilizations, not by accident, but by the very course of nature. Because if you have a food supply, if you have a water supply, if you're not being attacked, from below or around or above, if you have a place you can stay and eat and drink, then you can rest. Because what are you not doing? You're not out hunting and gathering and chasing game and following the game south and north and following the game's food source. You can rest. And interesting things start happening when we rest as a species. For example, we develop accounting, which was the first writing. Because if we're not moving around, then hey, that must be mine. So let me mark it. That's mine. That's not yours. That's mine. And by the way, this is where I'm going to plant. And I'm going to need to plant this many bushels to make it through the winter. Let me figure out how to do that, voila, accounting, which is eventually becomes writing. So a city is where you can rest. It's where you have a food supply. It's where you have a water supply. It's where you can make a home and a community and even a civilization. Now, you see here Roland Barthes, the French semiotician. I'm not going to inflict him on you too much, although he's wonderful. But I just want to use him to help us understand a way to understand and talk about myth tonight and throughout the series. First of all, myth is a type of speech. It's a way of talking. Okay, let's treat it that way. The form it takes is stories, of course, but it's a particular kind of story. What kind of story? A story laced with signs, or a semiotic story. Again, I don't want to get into French semiotics unless you do, because it would be fun. But I just want to distinguish it from other stories, right? So this is a story laden with symbols, right? That's what a myth is. You don't make a myth out of everyday speech. You make it out of special speech. One laden with symbols, and here Barthes is at his most brilliant. He says, myth is stolen language. We're going to talk about this as we go through the presentation tonight, and I think you'll see better at the end than maybe you do now. But myth is stolen language. Let me give you an example from far away in the 90s, so it won't seem so pressing. I remember, I don't know if they're still around, there was a group called Operation Rescue, an anti-abortion, anti-choice group led by, I think the guy's name was Randall Terry, something like that. Anyway, I remember him going around and using the language of the civil rights movement. And I'm like, yee. But then I'm like, well, brilliant, right? Because myth is stolen language. Myth does that all the time. Myth is a tool that can be used for good or evil. The Nazis loved myth and used it deftly. But again, notice how myth is stolen language. It's always, well, I'm going to let you see as we go through. I don't want to get into this too much. And more importantly, and I think this might be more evident to you, is that myth transforms history into nature. So what myth does is take something that did happen and make it have to have happened. Myth transforms history into nature. It takes a story and makes it inevitable. All right? All right, let's get into it. So creation mythology, let me just go over this briefly, is a genre of myth, and it's pretty clear what elements of the genre are. If you read about creation myths, you'll see that invariably the writer will say that they're about order out of chaos. And that's right, but the writer's typically thinking of Hesiod's Theogony, Genesis, Enuma Elish, Western stories, and even Eastern stories from the Vedas or whatever, or the Chinese, the Great Egg. But I don't think it has to be that strong to be a creation myth. Because if you do that, then there's only a certain number of creation myths. I think any time you're placing order on the world, it's a kind of creation. I remember Mario Vargas Llosa's, the Peruvian writer, his Nobel Prize acceptance speech for his work, which is fantastic. He's like, a writer does not like the world the way it is, and so he changes it in his work. I'm like, yeah, that's right, and that's what myth does. It does not like the world the way it is, or it doesn't understand the world the way it is, and so it tells a story to do that. Okay, good. As such, it is founding and grounding myths for individuals and societies. Okay, founding myths, okay, we always go back to, let's say, Genesis or whatever. That's who we are. And because that's who we are, this is who we become as a society. It's a pretty clear line there between the myth, the creation myth, and the order of society. We here in this room are most likely held by the Genesis story, and so I would say that story of the loss of innocence, of being at a time and place where nothing was wrong and everything was taken care of, and we didn't know about the world, and then one day we did, or over a few years we did, and we saw that we were naked and ashamed, and we saw good and evil, and we saw male and female, and light and dark, and suddenly the world changed. Well, that's our story. That's an interesting, good story. Imagine, it's also got a woman and a serpent. Imagine if you were held by another creation story. One I love to tell, I won't tell now because it takes too long, but the story of the woman who fell from the sky, about a native woman who existed in a plane above us and went through some tests with a magician and was impregnated by a tree and fell. She fell, the woman who fell from the sky to the earth, and she was our great mother. You'd feel different about trees. You'd feel different about women. This is what creation stories do. Again, we don't have to know this. In fact, they work most powerfully when we don't know this. The content of a creation story is always about the past, in content, but the real meaning, the connotation of the myth is about the present. Creation stories are really about the present, about what's happening now. We see this in the Genesis story too, where the more recent creation myth in Genesis 1 was actually written after the Babylonian exile. And they needed a story. They needed a new, like they were supposed to be in this land, right? This promised land, and they had been exiled. And so they create a new creation story to orient themselves in the present and for the future. And then finally, creation stories, we should never see them as frozen. They are dynamic, they are not static. They are constantly changing, just as the example of the peace story in Genesis, the priestly story, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, where you have to adapt a creation myth because your world's changing. And myths are always doing that. They're always trying to map the world, but the world keeps moving. So if you try to make this permanent, if you try to make this story concrete, and I dare say if you try to make it absolute, wow, you're going to get into a lot of trouble. All right. Let's begin with some creation stories from the land where we're standing on right now. The indigenous peoples of this area, or in California, I should say, but especially Southern California, were remarkably diverse. The quote I use from Kevin Starr in the Eventbrite is about that. In fact, I'll read it again. Think about this, just below the Tehachapi, just in the Southern California basin, 22 linguistic families, 135 separate languages. It was a paradigm for diversity. And in fact, Kevin Starr says this. Kevin Starr is the great historian of California. I'm sorry, Kevin. He passed away, but he's probably turning over in his grave, as I say, Kenneth Starr. He writes this: with so many languages, so many tribes and tribelets, so many autonomous communities, Native American California offered a paradigm of linguistic and cultural diversity, anticipating the population patterns of a later era, when the peoples of the world arrived in the region. Certain generalizations, however, can be made that are valid for all of the native peoples of California. They found in their various regions more than enough flora and fauna to sustain their lives. They were, therefore, not warlike in their relationships with each other, although quasi-ritualistic conflicts over disputed territories were not unknown. Large-scale political organizations were unnecessary. They had no need to make war. They did not, therefore, need elaborate hierarchies. Nature was relatively abundant, and simple and effective technologies for hunting and gathering sufficed. Although in their woven storage baskets, native Californian women achieved an art form that it was also eminently practical. And you find this all over indigenous cultures, is there's no real separation between art and craft. Theirs was a world of river, creek, desert, oasis, and of settlements that could easily be moved. Their therapy, their sociology even, and certainly their communal life was centered on sweat lodges where they warmed themselves with steam from water poured on fire-heated stones before plunging into a nearby river or lake, emerging renewed. In matters of property, they tended to be communal. In matters sexual, they tended toward balance and restraint with full regard for the rearing of children. Their ego, as far as we can tell, was not the self-conscious, self-regarding ego of post-Renaissance Europe, but rather an awareness of the self through the rhythms of daily life, the pageant of nature, the companionable presence of spirits, and the creation myths that gave them a cosmology and a history and fixed for them a place in the world, as creation myths do. With the exception of the acorn, a universal food, the sustenance of each region in this mosaic, distinct in its photography, climate, and varieties of fish and game, determined both the gross and subtle differences of life. The fishing people of the Northeast, the shell gatherers of the Central Coast, the hunter-gatherers of the interior, the agriculturalists of the Southeast, all had their cultures determined over the centuries by what was there in the first place by California itself. Now, I have done much of my work in Native American culture, so you may be hearing a whiff of romanticism here. I assure you it is not. Kevin Starr does not do that, so he happens to be describing the indigenous people of California. Now, if we were to describe some of the other indigenous peoples, it would be a lot rougher. So this is, I trust you'll believe me when I say this is not a kind of noble savage romanticism. But let's hear from a Native person herself. And you may know this story, the Rainbow Bridge from the Chumash.
Haku Laumpuashwashtets. My name is Julie Tumamayat Stensley. I am an island descendant. My father, Vincent Tumamayat, the son of Cecilio Tumamayat, and the grandson of Juan de Jesus Tumamayat. Our families come from Santa Cruz Island and Santa Rosa Island, from villages such as Shuahil, Laupch, Nanuani, and Maschal on Santa Cruz, and from the village of Hechaman on Santa Rosa Island. Sahipaka, once upon a time. Here on this beautiful island that we call Limu, meaning in the sea. You know it today as Santa Cruz Island. Mother Earth, Hutash, was out here. And as she had created many things here on the island, she thought something was missing. So she went to a very special plant and she gathered some magic seeds. And she threw the seeds out into the earth here on the island. And pretty soon, up from the ground, up from this beautiful earth, grew these beautiful people. She gave them many gifts here and showed them how to live happily on this island. Well, her husband, Achuoposh, the sky snake, today we know him as the Milky Way, he wanted to give the people a gift too, so he gave them the gift of fire by shooting a bolt of lightning to the ground. Well, the fires burned hot, and they kept warm with these fires, and they cooked their food. The villages started to grow and be populated with more and more children. Pretty soon, with all the noise from these children, Hutash was annoyed. And she decided that it was time for these people to move on and to move to another place. So she said to herself, I've got to think of some place to put these people, a different place, a place where they could spread out and be very happy. Well, the next morning, she gathered all the people up to a very high mountain, Siwot, or as we know it today, Mount Diablo. And as she told the people to look, as they looked up into the sky across the ocean, they saw a beautiful, beautiful rainbow, Wishtoyo. And she told them that that image was a rainbow bridge. And the rainbow bridge was going to take them to a new land that was very large. and they could fill that with people. Well, as people started to climb over the bridge and cross over, many became very dizzy and very frightened because there was a mist and a fog below. They couldn't even see the ocean. Well, as they started falling off, crying out to Hutash for help, she took pity and she changed them and transformed them into dolphins. And that is what we call our brothers and sisters today of the ocean, Alakoi. Those people who crossed over on the bridge went to a place called Tismahu, where it steams out. Today we know that place is Carpinteria. And the people came off that rainbow bridge and spread out into all these beautiful places on our mainland. And that is all.
You may know, especially if you're a native Angelino, I think this is taught now in the schools, that this is also the land of the Tongva. And we have a wonderful creation story from Shoshonean days here. Let's see. It begins when there was nothing at all was darkness. And then two quarrelsome brother deities, sea god and land god, worked together to beget land, sea, and animals. But the brothers fell into discord, as brothers do, after offering opposing visions for man's form. The disagreement turned disastrous when the land god decided to create human beings to his liking while the sea god was away, because sea gods must go away every now and then. When the sea god returned and saw what had been done in his absence, he became very angry and threatened to destroy his brother and human beings by flooding the land. At that time, the land was perfectly level. The sea god plunged into the sea and caused huge waves to rise and roll over the land. Land god first raised up hills and high mountains to protect himself and man from the sea, and so thwarted the evil designs of his brother. It was believed that land god, from his position at the apex of Mount San Antonio, sculpted these ramparts that thwarted the sea god. Around the same mountain, according to another legend, the Serranos came to settle, following a pure white eagle, the bird of their great captain from the north. The symbolic peak of Mount San Antonio marked an appropriate boundary between their territory and the other parts of the San Bernardino Mountains. Now let's do the Spanish creation mythology. I love this. I love all these stories. I especially love this story. So, California begins as a place in a novel. There was Garcia Ordóñez de Montalvo, who wrote in 1510 about the deeds of Esplandian. He was the hero of Amadis of Gaul at the siege of Constantinople in the novel. Among his allies at the siege were the Californians, a race of black Amazons under the command of Queen Calafia. California itself, according to Montalvo, was an island on the right hand of the Indies, very close to the side of terrestrial paradise, abounding in gold and precious stones. See, myth is stolen language. Where'd they steal that, right? The Californians rode griffins into battle and fought with golden weapons. Queen Calafia herself was, quote, very large in person, the most beautiful of them all, of blooming years, and in her thoughts desirous of achieving great things, strong of limb and of great courage. There she is in the Mark Hopkins Hotel in San Francisco. She is impressive. So, in the novel, they fight the battle. Calafia ends up going to Constantinople herself and becomes a Christian. I know, I'm sorry. She sounded awesome without that, but yeah. And so she gives up her promiscuous ways, according to the novel. It was until 1539 that the Spanish thought that this was the land of Calafia. And when they come upon it, It's actually Baja that they come upon. They landed on what they believed was an island, and they began to call it California. I love this so much, and I love that we were a mistake, but we were a very interesting mistake. And that could be the theme of the whole series. I don't know. Eventually, the Spanish discovered their mistake, that this was not an island. Baja was not an island, but a peninsula. And they would not really come back for another 230 years. When they did, they brought the Jesuits. So the Jesuits, you may know, were founded by Ignacio de Loyola, a soldier turned priest. And they were, maybe you've gone to a Jesuit school, Loyola, etc. They were scholars, educators, missionaries, and advisors to power. They were unique in that their belief, their missionary belief, you don't really find it anywhere else in the West, was enculturation. They did not want to annihilate the peoples they met. Again, this is remarkable in itself. And a whole interesting study, by the way, would be the Spanish or Europeans who did not side with the colonial enterprise in the 16th century, 15th and 16th century. Bartolome de las Casas, for one, was a Spanish friar who wrote this tract. It's now called The Devastation of the Indies, but it's basically letters back to Spain saying, you must stop this. God will punish us for this, what we're doing to these people. So there are a few of the pockets like that. The Jesuits were one of them. Now, make no mistake, they were interested in conversion. They wanted to make the indigenous people Catholic. But they did so by trying to protect them, and there was plenty to protect them from, as we'll see, and integrating their ways into the Spanish or European ways. It's not even fair to say the Spanish ways, it was the Jesuit way. They imagined these enclave utopias, they called them, these little islands of perfection where the kingdom of God will be. It was an interesting ideal and ideology. They were pretty much autonomous. They were separate from the state, and they were separate from the church. They were running their own game here. How long do you think that lasted? Not very long, because those were two powerful entities, the state and the church, that were saying, hey, hold on a second, what are you doing over there? In fact, by the 1760s, there was a growing conviction that the Jesuits were running everything on their own terms without allegiance or fealty to the state or church. And they were said to be a church within the church and a state within the state. Not good for the Spanish Empire. So yeah, it lasts about 70 years, and then some Spanish governors come in and replace the Jesuits with the Franciscans. And that's a whole other story. You probably know this story. Again, if you're an Angelino and you grew up here, you know of Father Junipero Serra, who founded the missions, along with some help from Galvez and Portola. The Franciscans were very different. They were, well, Serra himself was a unique cat. Let me see here. Yeah, he was a diminutive friar. He was just over 5 feet in height, and he loved suffering, physical suffering and mortification. And you know this if you know the history of religion. He was an ascetic Catholic, lots of ascetics throughout the world of many stripes, largely in India, I would say, most of them. But there's a Christian asceticism too. It was said that he slept on a board bed, scourged himself, lacerated his flesh with stones in the course of giving a sermon. I will not be doing that tonight. As such, Starr says he represented a paradox, a priest formed by an almost medieval piety, given a crucial assignment to establish civil society in California. It was impossible from the beginning, right? How does an ascetic establish a civil society? And so, as Starr writes, this sacred expedition of the Franciscans to remove the Jesuits from power and to found the missions, of course, was a phantasmagoria of physical hardship, deprivation, suffering, and death. That was the sacred expedition. But you know the story. Here it is, in case you don't. On September 4, 1781, 44 Hispanic men, women, and children of Native American, African, and European descent departed from the mission San Gabriel Archangel, accompanied by 2 mission priests and 4 soldiers. Los pobladores, the settlers, walked 9 miles to a location on the banks of the Los Angeles River. There, they established the Pueblo, the town of the Queen of the Angels. All right? I wanted to read, yeah. This is Kevin Starr's account of the Franciscan mission system. Quote, yet even a sympathetic observer acknowledging the benevolent intent of the mission system must see it by the standards of the 21st century as a violent intrusion into the culture and human rights of indigenous peoples. For more than 25 generations, Native Americans had lived harmoniously in their own cherished places under the terms of the cultures they had evolved. They had their own myths and rituals, their own way of life, their own fulfillments and dreams. And now they were being forced from their homelands, brought into a mission system, frequently against their will, and treated as children not yet possessed of full adulthood, not yet the gentle people of reason. As children, which that was a phrase, the people of reason, that's what the missions were trying to create. As children, they could be beaten when they proved recalcitrant or ran away, as they frequently did and were recaptured. Some of them made the transition successfully and were Hispanicized into productive farmers, artisans, vaqueros, and choral singers. Yet many died of shock at their displacement or of Spanish diseases. The sexual exploitation of Native American females by Spanish soldiers and other men in the colony was devastating as a matter of both personal violation and venereal disease. In contrast to Mexico, intermarriage was infrequent. The Native American population dropped precipitously, was most likely halved, in fact, by the end of the Spanish-Mexican era. It is difficult, in short, to see the mission system as resulting in anything other than the wholesale anthropological devastation, whatever the sincerely felt evangelical intent of the missionaries and the civilizing goals of the laws of the Indies. All right, so the pobladores found the Pueblo downtown on the plaza. And now I want to give you Robert Peterson and his wonderful excerpt of his wonderful podcast, The Hidden History of Los Angeles. What's the name of Los Angeles?
There are many ways of saying it. LA, Los Angeles. Everybody knows the name is Spanish in origin. But what is lesser known is that there is no agreement as to what LA's original name was. What we do know is that the settlers who founded LA back in 1781 meant to name the town after angels. But beyond that, there is disagreement and debate. Some contend the original name was
El pueblo de Nuestra Señora de Los Ángeles.
Others assert it was
El pueblo de Nuestra Señora de Los Ángeles de la Porciúncula.
Wikipedia says it was
El pueblo de Nuestra Señora de la Reina de Los Ángeles del Río de Porciúncula.
Or maybe
El pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Ángeles.
Or
El pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Ángeles del Río Porciúncula.
or
El pueblo de la reina de los ángeles sobre el río de Porciúncula.
books, historical articles, plaques, monuments around downtown. Many use different names. Two learned LA historians who both extensively studied this issue and who also happen to be best friends could not agree on what LA's original name is. So I imagine the debate will continue and we may never know for sure. But what's in a name? I'm not going to quote Shakespeare, and I don't know if LA really smells sweet like a rose, but LA is still the LA we know today regardless of its original name. But the fact that the original name has, in a sense, been lost is representative of this city and its residents who too often forget our past. And the variety of different names is yet another example of how change seems to be the only constant in this city. And also, how determining what is true or authentic in LA often depends on who you ask. So, next time you are on Olvera Street, walk onto the plaza and look at the various plaques and monuments and see how they characterize LA's original name and how many of them disagree. Searching for LA's original name on various plaques and monuments around downtown. These are just a few of the places where LA's hidden history lies.
I want to mark that, and okay. I love his podcast. I think he's brilliant, but I love how he struggles at the end. It's because, listen, we have to remember this, but change is the only constant, right? That dilemma he puts himself on the horns of is our dilemma. LA is like trying to nail smoke to a wall. And if David Hewlin were here, he would agree with me. If you know his works, he's always doing this, helping us understand LA's fluidity. But we must remember the past. Really, we don't even know what the name was. We can't even agree on what the name of the city is. That's perfect. I think that's perfect. I think that's mythological. Let me talk a little bit about Mexican creation mythology and then American creation mythology of Los Angeles, and then I'll let you in and we can talk. So the Mexican creation story of Los Angeles runs for a very short time, 1822 to 1848. I think you know why it ends in 1848 probably. And it was the land grant rancho. It was romanticized. And I can say that firmly and confidently because of my next slide. But again, let's hear Kevin Starr on what the Mexican creation story was. What was it like during Mexican California? So the missions become secularized through the help of a very interesting guy named Figueroa, by the way. And the remaining padres were repatriated to Mexico City or Spain. A new social institution, the land grant rancho, has become predominant. All told, more than 600 land grants were made during the Mexican era, and these vast holdings, extending across the rolling hills of coastal California as far north as Petaluma, above San Francisco Bay, dominated the economy and defined the society of Mexican California. Now ensued the age of the great dons. Don Jose Andres Sepulveda, the feudal lord of the 80-square-mile Rancho San Joaquin in present-day Orange County, granted to Don Jose in 1837 by Governor Alvarado. There in his capacious hacienda called Refugio, Don Jose and his extended family lived a life that would later be celebrated in California legend. For a later generation, rancho life represented California at its best. Well, what was this life? Here it is. See if this doesn't sound like a creation story. It was a prodigal existence, a full, generous existence, unheeding. Innumerable longhorn cattle roamed the hills. Families were large and extended. It was common for more than 20 relatives, near relatives, and retainers to sit down to plentiful meals of beef, tortillas, chili peppers, rice, tomatoes, garbanzo, and green beans, pumpkins, onions, oranges, apples, pears, and imported chocolate and spices. It was a garden. All of it prepared by Indian cooks under the supervision of the mistress of the house. Families met for 3 full meals a day, and there were mid-morning and mid-afternoon snacks. Okay? In a society challenged by a paucity of civil institutions, 2 or 3 schools, 1 printing press, the absence of urbanism, family was everything. The fundamental fact and the premise of social life. Everyone was connected by blood or by baptismal relationships, and no child went uncared for. If one needed a horse, one borrowed it from the rancho next door and left it at another one, and made one's own horses likewise available to others. At designated times of the year, religious feast days, the completion of branding or a slaughter, the rancheros would gather their families and retainers at one or another hacienda for week-long festivities that included late nights of dancing to the music of guitars, violins, flutes, castanets, and the hilarity of the evening intensified by imported wine, a domestic brandy called aguardiente, and spiked punches. On such festive occasions, the dons would dress in elaborate charro riding suits and ride on silver-studded saddles that represented a significant portion of their wealth. I'm surprised that lasted as long as it did, because it seems almost unreal. But this is apparently what the Mexican California was like for those few decades. What changed? We did. We came. People from the East. Why did we come? Well, for a lot of reasons, but the single biggest reason we came, those of us from the East, those of us of European descent, was a novel again. Again, it was a novel that brought us here. I will be referring to this book a lot, and it's in our bookstore, but I highly recommend it. Carey McWilliams, Southern California, An Island Upon the Land. I didn't read you or quote to you from his section on the devastation of indigenous peoples because it was just too much. It was too hard to read, and I didn't want to. You can read it on your own. His chapter on Helen Hunt Jackson and Ramona is priceless and worthy of your consideration and time. Carey McWilliams, yeah, in the bookstore, we have it. You're going to hear from him a lot. So he says he sees a lot of confusing conflicts. Carey McWilliams was a socialist, journalist, the friend of labor and the common person, and he just did not understand sentimentalism, which is what Ramona is. So you may have read or heard that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said what changed the Civil War was a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Nathaniel Hawthorne hated Harriet Beecher Stowe for that, and he called her and her kind a bunch of damn scribbling women because it was sentimental, it was popular. You can never be forgiven for being popular by the intelligentsia. I don't have that problem either way, so I don't know. But so this is dripping with sentimentality and romanticism. I said Kevin Starr wasn't romanticizing Native people. Here it is. First of all, McWilliams is like, first of all, why are we talking about these Indian people like they were noble savages? Early on, this is 1946, and he sees this like, whoa, this is some projection, some white projection of what Native people were before we decimated them. Why do they blame themselves for this? Because the people coming from the East are largely Protestant. Of course, the Spanish and Mexican are Catholic. And suddenly, in Helen Hunt Jackson's imaginary world, which quickly turned into the real world, it's the Protestants who are to blame. So we would call this today white guilt. But Carey McWilliams had never seen that before, and he's like, I don't understand. The Spanish were horrible. The Franciscans were terrible. Why are you blaming Protestants for this? And what's this obsession with the mission past of California. He just didn't understand it. Here's what he says. Considering the long, dark record of Indian mistreatment in Southern California, it's difficult to account for the curious legend of Ramona that has developed in the region about the well-beings of natives under mission rule. According to this legend, the missions were havens of happiness and contentment for the Indians, places of song, laughter, good food, beautiful languor, and the mystical adoration of Christ. He goes on. The newness of the land itself, the newness of California, and I think he's right about this, and we see this a lot in the colonization of the Americas, is the newness of the land creates a blank slate. It wasn't blank, right? But they perceived it mythologically and ideologically as blank. The newness of the land itself seems, in fact, to have compelled, to have demanded the evocation of a mythology which could give people a sense of continuity in a region long characterized by rapid social dislocations. There it is. That's the function of a creation mythology. There it is. He says it. He doesn't know he's talking about mythology. He's talking about a falsehood, but he's actually talking about mythology as it functions. And of course, he's wonderful. And of course, it would be a tourist, a Google-eyed, umbrella-packing tourist who first discovered the past of Southern California and people with curious creatures of her own invention. He goes on, shaking his head as he writes, I'm sure. When the book was first published, Ramona, it provoked a storm of protest in the Southland. Egged on by various civic groups, the local critics denounced it as a tissue of falsehoods, a travesty on history, a damnable libel on Southern California. But the book was perfectly timed, providentially timed, he says, to coincide with the great invasion of homeseekers and tourists to the region. As these hordes of winter tourists began to express a lively interest in visiting, quote, Ramona's land, unquote, Southern California experienced an immediate change of attitude and overnight became passionately Ramona conscious. Beginning about 1887, Ramona promotion of fantastic proportions began to be organized in the region. What does Ramona, what does he call it? Ramona promotion coincide with? The arrival of the railroad and the discovery of oil. It was providentially timed, some sort of providence. And so people flow into Los Angeles. You can look at the tables of the population growth. It's astounding how fast Los Angeles grows. And again, it's because of a sentimental novel of a native girl and a half-breed, a Mexican girl and a half-breed native man who fall in love and are not accepted by their cultures. And it's really kind of dark. I mean, Alessandro, who's the male protagonist, he's a sheep shearer, and he ends up with Senora, and they're not accepted by any society, Mexican or white or native. And so they end up just kind of wandering through the San Gabriel Mountains until he goes crazy. Alessandro goes crazy. But it brought people here. It brought maybe your ancestors here. And I want to end tonight with, how to pronounce the city in which you live. Guess what? We're not sure.
This is Q&A LA. Today's question.
What is a proper way to pronounce Los Angeles?
The short answer is that it depends on whether you're using the Spanish or anglicized pronunciation. The Spanish pronunciation is Los Angeles, and the anglicized pronunciation is Los Angeles. But that answer doesn't tell the whole story. You see, if you asked an Angelino that question 100 years ago, you would have received a different response. For almost a century, there was a heated debate about how to properly pronounce the name of the city. For example, author Charles Lummis wrote in 1914.
There is no other city in the world whose inhabitants so miserably and shamelessly, and with so many varieties of foolishness, miscall the name of the town they live in.
For the record, Lummis pronounced it Los Angeles. At the time, Lummis counted no less than 12 distinct permutations of the city's name in circulation, in addition to his own.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles.
And these variations would appear on radio and TV. Here's Bing Crosby.
We met on a train coming from Los Angeles.
Don Wilson from The Jack Benny Show.
Now let's pick them up on the Super Chief en route to Los Angeles.
L.A. Mayor Sam Yorty.
To try and elect the mayor for the city of Los Angeles.
A character in Alfred Hitchcock's 1942 film Saboteur.
I'm looking for a man named Frank Fry. I met him up in Los Angeles.
Even Bugs Bunny.
Don't look much like Los Angeles to me. I knew I should have taken that left turn at Albuquerque.
So, how did we get to the pronunciation that we use today, Los Angeles? So, starting in 1781, Angelenos pronounced the name Los Angeles. And this lasted for about a century, until demographic changes started affecting how the town's name was being pronounced. The Pueblo became an American town in 1847, but it wasn't until the 1880s, when large numbers of English-speaking Americans started flowing into the city, and people really started anglicizing the name. And this was the start of almost a century-long debate as to how to properly pronounce the city's name. Some wanted to stick with the Spanish pronunciation. Others advocated for different variations of anglicized pronunciations. An LA Times article from 1918 put it this way.
One of the mooted questions among visitors in Southern California is the proper pronunciation of the name Los Angeles. Although the Times daily instructs the uninitiated, varied pronunciations are in vogue, and it now seems doubtful if ever the soft Spanish accent will prevail.
The Times advocated for the Spanish pronunciation and actually printed its preferred pronunciation, Los Angeles, under the paper's masthead. But many English-speaking Angelenos expressed difficulties with the Spanish pronunciation. For example, it was reported that in 1912, a teacher at Selma Avenue Grammar School was assigned the duty of teaching her students the Spanish pronunciation of the city. But she faced an unexpected obstacle. When attempting to say Los Angeles, it apparently sounded like the students were saying hell. Los Angeles. Word got back to the parents that students were saying hell in class, which at the time was a big no-no. The teacher tried to explain that the students were not saying hell, but the damage was already done. The school immediately stopped all attempts to teach the Spanish pronunciation. So, even with advocacy from the LA Times, the Spanish pronunciation of the city did not win out. In 1934, the United States Board of Geographic Names decreed that the name should be anglicized to Los Angeles. As expected, the Times was not happy with the decree, arguing that the pronunciation made the city sound like some brand of fruit preserve. But dropping the Spanish pronunciation did not put an end to the debate. People continued to argue about the, quote, proper anglicized version. Should you say a hard G or a soft G? Los Angeles or Los Angeles? Should you end with a les or a lus? Los Angeles? Los Angeles? In 1952, the mayor of the city, Fletcher Bowron, impaneled a jury of experts to, once and for all, settle the question. The little Pueblo had grown to become the third largest city in the country, but people were still unsure what to call it. A final decision was needed. So a panel of experts was chosen to render a verdict and proclaim an official pronunciation of the city. The jury was made up of professors, representatives from the press, radio announcers, and the Historical Society of Southern California. And, after deliberating, they came to a verdict. The official pronunciation would be Los Angeles. The mayor announced the verdict during one of his Thursday night fireside chat speeches.
Citizens of Los Angeles, you will note that I address you in the accustomed way, but with a different pronunciation of the name of our city. For a great many years, I've been accustomed to the use of the hard G, Los Angeles. The citizen jury has rendered its verdict. I accept that verdict. I yield to the expression of the majority, and from henceforward I will pronounce the fair name of our great city, Los Angeles.
Mayor Bowen, a self-professed hard G man, stated, "This means breaking the habit of a near lifetime, but I'll go along." Interestingly, Mayor Bowen was actually more worried about another deviation of the city's name. The Times reported in 1952 that
the mayor prayed that civic pride would prevent its citizens from ever referring to it as LA.
he lost that battle as well. Some, though, were not as easygoing with a verdict. The Los Angeles Herald-Express ran a headline stating that civic leaders balked on the chosen pronunciation and even put the Webster's Dictionary pronunciation on the front page of the newspaper to contradict the now official pronunciation. The paper also quoted a civic leader who disagreed with the mayor's experts.
I do not agree with the so-called jury. Los Angeles should be pronounced as it reads, that is, Los Angeles. And I also wish someone would get radio and television people to pronounce rodeo correctly. It isn't rodeo, it's rodeo.
And radio announcer Red Blanchard later said of the decision,
The city council took a vote and decided on the official pronunciation of Los Angeles from that moment on would be Los Angeles. Well, I never could say that. I don't want to say it, and I won't say it. And those pinkos in the city hall can't make me say it. Well, so much for Los Angeles.
Nevertheless, the city now had an official anglicized pronunciation. A senior librarian was appointed to head a committee to notify all publishers of dictionaries, as well as all radio and television stations and boards of education and libraries.
Here in Los Feliz, we don't know what you're talking about. So, sorry. The town of the Queen of the Angels, what does this mean? For me, at least, looking at it mythologically, it means we've always been a town of the imaginary. Every town's a town of the imaginary, but I think it's unique in Los Angeles. After all, we began in the mind of a 16th century novelist, and the real people who followed the character in the novel recognized the place as California. Remember Roland Barthes' criteria for myth. It is the land, the town of the symbolic. I don't think I need to explain this, but go back to the Tongva myth, go back to the Chumash myth of the landscape itself, and Carrie McWilliams has a lot of good material on this as well, about the uniqueness of the landscape here and the symbols that give rise to it, not to mention the symbols of the people who came here. Again, most of whom of European descent came because of a novel. Los Angeles and the mythological, we are the city of stories. I don't say that lightly. I can defend that quite well. You New Yorkers who are thinking you're the center of stories. We produce more stories and have for a century than any place in the world. And we're going to talk about that in on another night. Los Angeles is palimpsest. I like this very much. You may know, and we'll talk about a little bit, Norman Klein's History of Forgetting about Los Angeles. We write over ourselves a lot. And I think, like for Robert Peterson and his podcast, that's problematic. He wants to reach back through or down into the palimpsest and find the original, but I think as an Angelino myself, I don't care. I kind of like the stories to keep going, you know. Sure, there are things that are lost. There are stories that are lost. There are peoples that are lost. There are landscapes that are lost in the process, but there seems to be something about this space that lends itself to recreation all the time. And if I may, you can call bullshit on this if you want, but I think we're the city of angels, and I mean that as what angels are. They are divine communicators. As such, they are they occupy a liminal space between the everyday and the sacred. And so they bring messages of the sacred. I think we might work the other way. We produce messages to the sacred. Again, not just our filmmaking history, but our history, which we keep forgetting. And in fact, maybe there was nothing really to remember, because we still can't decide on what our actual name is or how to pronounce it. Thank you for your attention.